and pocket the half-crowns I gave him. And I, like a fool, never suspected him once, or thought that he knew anything about Fred coming to the flat. He didn't let it out till the night Sir Horace quarrelled with me. Sir Horace found out about Fred, and when I went up to see him as usual he told me that he had finished with me, and he called Hill up to show me out. 'Show this young lady out,' he said in that cold, haughty voice of his, and the wily old villain Hill just bowed and held the door open. He followed me downstairs and let me out at the side door. There he said, 'I'll escort you to the front gate, if you will permit me, miss. I usually lock the gate about this time.' I thought nothing of this because he had come with me to the front gate before. He followed me down the garden path through the plantation till we reached the front gate. He opened the gate for me and I said, 'Good night, Hill.' But instead of his replying 'Good night, Miss Fanning,' as he usually did, he hissed out like a serpent, 'You tell Birchill I want to see him tomorrow, and I'll come to the flat about 9 o'clock. Tell him an old friend named Field wants to see him. Don't forget the name, Field.' Then he locked the gate and was gone before I could speak a word. I gave Fred his message next morning. I wish to God that I hadn't," she continued. "I asked Fred not to keep the appointment, but he insisted on doing so. He said that he and Field had been good friends in the gaol, and that Field had told him that if he ever got on to anything he would let him know. He seemed quite pleased at the idea of meeting Field again. I told him to beware that Field wasn't laying a trap for him, but he wouldn't listen to me. Sure enough, Field, or Hill as he calls himself now, did come over that evening, and I let him in myself. I took him into the sitting room where Fred was, and I sat down in a corner of the room pretending to read a book, so that I could hear what our visitor had to say. But the cunning old devil whispered something to Fred, and Fred came over to me and asked if I'd mind leaving them alone for half an hour. I didn't mind so much, because I knew I could get it all out of Fred after Hill had gone. He remained shut up with Fred for nearly 2 hours, and then I heard Fred letting him out of the front door. Fred came in to me and I soon got the strength of it all from him. What do you think Hill had come for? To get Fred to burgle Sir Horace's house. And Fred had agreed to do it. I cried and I stormed and went into hysterics, but he wouldn't budge. You know how obstinate he can be when he likes. He said that Hill had told him there was a good haul to be picked up. Sir Horace was going to Scotland for the shooting, and the servants were to be sent to his country house, so the coast would be clear. Hill was to leave everything right at Riversbrook on the afternoon of the 18th of August, and he was to come across to the flat and let Fred know. Hill came as he promised, but as soon as he came in I could see that something had happened. The first words he said were that Sir Horace had returned unexpectedly from Scotland. I was glad to hear it, for I thought that meant that there would be no burglary. I said as much to Fred and he would have agreed with me, but that devil Hill was too full of cunning. "Of course, if you're frightened we'd better call it off," he said. Fred had been drinking during the day, and you know what he's like when he's had a little too much. "I was never frightened of any job yet," he said, "and I'd do this job tonight if the house was full of rozzers." Hill pretended that he wasn't particular whether the thing came off or not that night, but all the while he kept egging Fred on to do it. Oh, I can see now what his game was. In spite of all I could do or say, it was arranged that Fred should go over and see if it was quite safe to carry out the job. Hill said he thought Sir Horace was going out that night and wouldn't be home until the early morning. About 9 o'clock Fred went off, leaving Hill and me alone in the flat together. How I wish now that I had killed him when I had such a good chance." We sat there, scarcely speaking, and heard the clock strike the hours. After midnight I began to get restless, for I thought something must have happened to Fred. Hill said in a low voice, "It's time Fred was back." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when I heard Fred's step outside, and I ran to let him in. He came in as white as a sheet. "Fred," I cried as soon as I saw him, "there's some blood on your face." He didn't answer a word until he had taken a big drink of whisky out of the decanter. Then he said in a whisper, "Sir Horace Fewbanks has been murdered." "Murdered!" cried Hill, leaping up from his chair. "He can act well, I can tell you." "My God, Fred, you don't mean it!" "He's dead, I tell you," replied Fred fiercely. I thought, and at the time I suppose Hill thought, that Fred had shot him either accidentally or in order to escape capture. He seemed to guess what we were thinking, for he swore that he had nothing to do with it. Sir Horace was dead on the floor when he got there. He told us all that had happened. When he got to Riversbrook he found lights burning on the ground floor. He jumped over the fence at the side and hid in the garden. He was there only a few minutes when he saw the lights go out. Then the front door was slammed and a woman walked down the garden path to the gate." "A woman!" exclaimed Kemp. "Yes, a woman. Why not? She had been to see Sir Horace, one of his society mistresses. I'll bet it was on her account that he came back from Scotland." "What time was this?" he asked with interest. "About 10:30," replied the girl. "And this woman, this lady, turned out the lights and closed the front door?" "So Fred says. Of course he thought Sir Horace had done it, but he found out later that Sir Horace was dead." "I can't understand it," said Kemp. "What was she doing there? If she found the man dead, why didn't she inform the police? No, wait a minute. She'd be afraid to do that if she was a society woman." "It might be her who killed him," said the girl. "Does Fred think that?" asked Kemp, looking at her closely. "Fred doesn't know what to think," she replied, "but it must have been this woman or Hill who killed him. I feel sure myself that it was Hill." "This woman puzzles me," said Kemp thoughtfully. "She must have been a cool hand if she went round turning out the lights after finding his dead body. About 10:30, you said?" "That is as near as Fred can make it." "Go on with your story," he said. "I'm interested in this. You were saying that Fred saw the lights go out and then this woman came out of the house and walked away." "Well, Fred got into the house through one of the windows at the side, the one Hill had told him to try," continued the girl. "But first of all he waited about half an hour in the garden, so as to give Sir Horace time to go to sleep. He was able to find his way about the house, as Hill had given him a plan. He felt his way upstairs and finding a door open he went into the room and flashed his electric torch. By its light he saw Sir Horace Fewbanks lying huddled up in a corner with a big pool of blood beside him on the floor. He felt him to see if he was dead. The body was quite warm, but it was limp. Sir Horace was dead. Fred says he lost his nerve and ran for it as hard as he could. He rushed downstairs and out of the house and got back to the flat as fast as he could. The three of us sat there shaking with fear and wondering what to do. Hill was the first to recover himself. In his cunning, plausible way he pointed out that it was altogether unlikely that suspicion would fall on Fred or him. All we had to do was to keep quiet and say nothing, then we'd have no awkward questions put to us. It was his suggestion that we should send an anonymous letter to Scotland Yard telling them that Sir Horace had been murdered. That would be much better, he said, than leaving the body there until he